Okay, well that leads quite nicely to the next presentation, which is about live streaming and particularly how we monetize it in a way that doesn't put viewers off, and especially young viewers. So I'd like to welcome Tim Sewell, who's the CEO at Yospace. His company was recently acquired by RTL Group, which is one of the largest media owners in Europe, and they have a growing ad tech portfolio, which he's now part of. So give a big round of applause for Tim, please.
Thanks, John. So I guess I'll start off by just covering off why Yospace is qualified to be talking about this particular topic. So the first thing, I guess, we've been doing it for quite a long time, and if you look at our timeline, I'm not going to bore everyone going through all of that. You may say we've been doing it for too long. We launched our VOD server-side ad insertion offering in 2010. We announced our live ad insertion solution at IBC in 2011, and I told the board that every UK broadcaster would be using it by the end of 2012 because it was just a no-brainer, which showed how naive we were at the time. And then if you actually look, it was 2014 before we saw the full first commercial launch of ad replacement on live linear simulcast, and that was actually with 10 in Australia in time for the Winter Olympics. So we've been working with the Australian broadcasters since 2014. And if you fast forward to today, we have customers across 5 different continents. In the UK, we're working with all of the broadcasters who make their channels available as linear simulcast. In Australia, we're working with 10, 9, and 7. And in the US, we're powering DirecTV Now. So we have a fairly unique view of what broadcasters are doing in the live server-side ad insertion space, and also in how it's growing over time. And I'll come on to talk about some of the specific case studies and specific broadcasters we're working with a little later in my presentation. Fairly obviously, it's often major sporting events that drive the decision to adopt server-side ad insertion because it's unlocking new inventory that wasn't previously available. And if you're trying to do it in a way that is broadcast quality in terms of the viewer experience, the only option is to do that server-side. So we've now got 3 or 4 years experience of powering Champions League and Premiership football coverage. The last 3 Australian Open tennis tournaments, we've been working with initially 7 and in the recent tournament 9 to enable ad insertion. And then moving forward, obviously there's a lot of major events coming up that again we'll be delivering ad insertion for. But I guess it's important to say it's not only about major sports events. So all of the broadcasters who work with us today are doing ad replacement 24/7 on their linear channels. And you know, event TV like MKR or Married at First Sight, which you can probably guess I'm not necessarily the target audience for, may not deliver quite the same concurrency as major sports events like Champions League or NFL, but they still deliver very, very large audiences consistently. And so you're unlocking a huge amount of inventory by enabling SSAI for those types of programming. So the key thing is, users no longer see any difference between an OTT service, whether that's BVOD or live simulcast, linear simulcast. To them, it is all just TV. And similarly, the expectations of the advertisers are growing all the time. So to an end user, particularly if they're watching on a connected TV, which is an increasing percentage of the audience that we see, they just expect it to work. They expect it to be like TV. And to be honest, if you can tell that the ads are being replaced, then the solution that is being used isn't really fit for purpose. It should be completely seamless to the end user. It really should look just like TV. But obviously from a monetization and advertising perspective, there is an expectation that there's genuine one-to-one addressability. And it may not be that in fact, it won't be that the targeting is actually down to an individual user from a demographic point of view, but certainly the measurement is one-to-one, and increasingly the level of segmentation and the ability to use the data that the broadcasters have been gathering over the last 3 or 4 years becomes increasingly critical in terms of optimizing the monetization. Obviously, because this is OTT, there's the potential to have interactive elements. Not all interactivity necessarily makes sense in the context of live, but certainly in BVOD, the interactivity that you can introduce while still delivering a TV experience is important. The fact that we have real-time analytics, so because we're managing sessions for every user when they're viewing content, we're able to report seconds after the break exactly what the fill rate for a given break was, exactly what sort of response times we're seeing from the various other parts of the ad tech ecosystem. If there are issues in ad operations in terms of how campaigns have been configured, those problems can be spotted in between ad breaks and rectified so that you don't lose revenue where historically it may be 24 hours after a major sports event that you discover that there was a problem in the ad operations or in the ad decisioning configuration which lost massive amounts of revenue potential. And in the context of server-side ad insertion versus other solutions, it is to some extent a cure for things like ad blockers. Increasingly, when we first started doing server-side ad insertion, almost all of the decisioning was first party, which is relatively straightforward, but increasingly, and particularly in more advanced markets like the US and Australia, a huge percentage of the inventory that's being trafficked now is programmatic, and that puts some slightly different and unique challenges for the end-to-end delivery for users. So we would argue, and apologies for saying Yospace there, but we would argue that there is a real value to working with a specialist vendor in this space, and whether it's us or whether it's someone like Brightcove or Switch Media, the knowledge that the SSOI vendor has to have in terms of all of the streaming and broadcast infrastructure, the green box up there in terms of the streaming protocols, the signaling automation systems, encoding, and delivering a true broadcast grade SLA, as well as understanding all of the complexities of the ad tech ecosystem, really does mean that this particular area is a true specialism. And whilst there may be many reasons why you may not choose to work with one of the big internet brands who offer this type of capability, the fact that a large part of the knowledge that you need is very broadcast specific means that we think you really should be working with a specialist. So the end user, they no longer actually care how it's being delivered. So to them, this is just TV. So there's a natural assumption that it scales. So I think the first, in 2014, the largest event that we performed SSAI for was around about, I think we just about hit 40,000 peak concurrent users. And we thought that was quite impressive. Fast forward to the start of this year, the biggest event that we've had so far this year for a single broadcast customer was 3.2 million. With fully personalized ad decisioning for all of those users and all of the reporting. And the end users don't really care that the numbers have got bigger. To them, it should all just work. But they also are starting to have an increasingly demanding view of what should be delivered. So it is just TV, but the whole point about OTT is it does allow you to deliver enhanced user experiences. So things that may not sound particularly clever, like live pause or live rewind, the ability to come in 15 minutes after the program starts and still see it from the beginning. So technically, from a streaming perspective, those capabilities have been around for a long time, but they do put quite a lot of challenges in, both from a scaling technology perspective for server-side ad insertion, but also business logic about what you do when users are scrubbing around through breaks. Do you force them to watch the break? Do you deliver a lighter payload of ads so they have a shorter break? And then similarly, particularly for major sports, increasingly there are things you can do around the ability to jump to particular highlights in the match. So deliver an enhanced user experience, which isn't specifically to do with advertising, but it can break the advertising model if it's not properly thought through. I'm just going to play a short video. BT Sport, who we've been working with for 3 seasons now,
The BT Sport app is putting you right in the thick of it. And with enhanced viewing for the UEFA Champions League, UEFA Europa League, Premier League and Emirates FA Cup, including live match choice and interactive timeline and multicam features, you call the shots. And after giving you the ultimate front row experience of the Champions League final, we're rolling out our VR feature to a variety of amazing BT Sport events.
That is sick.
Get the best seat in the house with the BT Sport app.
So the point here is nothing there is necessarily specific to SSAI, except that it means that you're having to manage a lot of complex use cases throughout a potentially 4 or 5 hour sporting event so that they're still able to monetize their content. Both the live breaks at the point that a user's watching in live, but also as they start jumping around through the timeline to see particular highlights. And the key thing is doing all of this at scale, because as I say, back in 2014, the audiences were relatively small for this type of capability. Today, as I say, our biggest event this year was 3.2 million. We expect by the end of the year that will probably have doubled, a combination of new markets launching, but also an increasing consumption via connected TV. And we talk about scale. It's not just about scaling for the end user experience. It's also scaling from an advertising perspective. And so that's delivering fully personalized advertising to a growing audience, but also increasing complexity in the ad tech ecosystem, in the programmatic landscape. Traditionally, as I say, when we first launched, all of the advertising that we were seeing was first party sold. And so the time that we can allow between when we reach an ad break, when we need a decision back from the ad server, and then when we deliver that ad to the user, was fairly easy to accommodate. We can, as standard, we can allow 500 milliseconds for that response. But as you start to introduce programmatic, obviously each of the step in that programmatic workflow needs to allow time for the handshake to take place. So the next step is obviously to go from first party sold to a third party wrapper, which takes you straight to an ad. So that adds an additional degree of latency. But then you also see increasingly that you have a third-party wrapper that's pointing to a further third-party wrapper that's pointing to a third-party ad. By the time you're doing all of this, even at relatively low scale, there's a fairly high probability that because we have to deliver a linear live stream to the end user with no buffering and no degradation of user experience, we probably have had to give up and go back to the underlying ads by the time all of that has taken place, because otherwise we risk there being buffering for the end user. Additionally, most of the ad tech ecosystem wasn't originally designed with live in mind. So even for event TV, the first show of the new season of Game of Thrones, users are not all starting to watch the VOD episode at the same time. Whereas in linear, typically we see all of in the standard just-in-time mode. In other words, when we're making the ad call just ahead of the break, we'll see all of the ad requests being made in about 1.5 video segments. So depending on duration of those video segments, somewhere around 6 to 9 seconds. And typically, either the primary ad servers or the programmatic platforms can't really handle that scale of requests in such a short period of time, either just as a scaling consideration or because it triggers DDoS prevention and fraud prevention, because it's not the sort of traffic that a lot of the platforms, particularly those further down the chain, expect to see. So the way that we combat this, particularly for large, it's something that we do for both large-scale events, but also if there's a heavy amount of programmatic that's in play, is we introduce what we call prefetch. So it's the idea that at the end of the previous break, we start to make requests to the primary ad server or programmatic platform for the next break. And by doing that, it guarantees that we won't make more requests per second than the ad platform can handle. So that by the time we get to the break, we've had time to resolve the ad decisioning for all users, and then at the end of that break, we start prefetching for the next break. That puts some challenges in place because not all media buyers or programmatic platforms would expect to have such a long period between when we make the ad request and when the impression is actually fired. So we do have the option to put a pre-roll marker in other words, start fetching for the next break, perhaps only 5 or 10 minutes before it's due to come. That's more feasible for linear live TV than for major sports events, but it is a way of reducing that gap between initial ad request and impression being fired. But what it does ensure is that you don't have a situation where on major sports events you suddenly see a huge drop in fill rate simply because of timeouts through the various aspects of the ADS and programmatic workflow. I won't go into too much detail on this one, but by implementing prefetch type capability, what it also allows us to do is to try and be more intelligent about the amount of information that the primary ad server has about what's going on in the programmatic space. So because we are aware of the break ahead of time and are doing that decisioning ahead of time, we are able to make calls out to multiple programmatic platforms, so AppNexus, Tilaria, SpotX. We're able to know from a competitive separation standpoint, which categories they have to deliver into the pod. And then at the point that we make the call into the primary ad server, we're able to pass all of that information through so that you can have a properly competitively separated pod that's been satisfied by multiple programmatic sources, and that has also allowed you to actually optimize from a revenue point of view, where the traditional waterfall model can often mean that the highest bidder isn't actually presented in the pod simply because of where they sat in that flow. I'm not going to go through all of these case studies, but I'll just pick out a couple. AT&T obviously are interesting because of the US model with respect to the 2 minutes of hour that they have from the national programmers, and so that introduces quite a lot of complexity in terms of how you have to do that decisioning and the business logic that needs to be implemented. But I'll just jump forward and talk a little about these last two. So TV4 in Sweden is particularly interesting because they back in 2014, started to implement a strategy of total TV where they were actively looking to drive audience from traditional linear TV to consumption over OTT so that they could implement an addressable TV strategy. So today, all of their VOD and live content has server-side ad replacement against it. In their linear TV programming, various times a year, they actually, when they get to, for example, their lottery, rather than giving the lottery results on linear TV, they drive people to their OTT service, their TV4 Play, to get those results. And Matthias Berg, the COO, announced recently that this total TV strategy has been attributed with delivering their strongest ever both revenue and profit results in 2018. So I think that was partly driven by the Nordic market saw a more aggressive shift from traditional TV consumption to OTT around that time. And then the final one that I will just talk a little bit about is Medialand in Belgium, because it plays to the idea of reducing ad load. And they came up with, I'd love to say it was our idea, but it wasn't, it was theirs. They came up with the idea that to actually reduce the ad load in traditional linear TV is quite difficult to do because you have to look at all of your programming and scheduling, and it's not as simple as just simply deciding you're going to serve less minutes of ads per hour. So we implemented a solution where if a user chooses to start watching a program even 10 or 15 minutes behind live, then as we get to those ad breaks, rather than delivering the traditional TV ad load, we actually shorten the ad load. So instead of getting 3 minutes of advertising, the users see perhaps 60 or 90 seconds of advertising. They have a particularly young slew in terms of the audience for their OTT service. So they saw this as key. And it's a sort of an interesting way of reducing ad load without totally reinventing the end-to-end model. It's something that's allowed them to experiment across different genre types in terms of exactly what is the optimum ad load to have. And then just finally in Australia, as I've already mentioned, we've been working in the Australian market since 2014. We're now just completed our third Australian Open. And one of the things we see in Australia is that probably second only to the US, programmatic is a huge element of what is of how advertising is being traded, and from an SSAI point of view, that's given us a lot of insight in terms of how we need to optimize so that we can really maximize the fill rates that are achieved. I won't cover this off in any great detail. Essentially, from a viewer experience point of view, that's the main driver for server-side ad insertion. You need to consider the enhanced UX that users are starting to expect in terms of the advanced features that OTT can deliver. From a monetization point of view, there's quite a lot involved with supporting this at true scale and doing it with one-to-one addressability. Programmatic requires a lot of additional consideration and investment in terms of exactly how all of the different parts of the workflow work together. And there's a lot that you can do with real-time measurement in terms of the measurement that OTT delivers that traditional TV perhaps doesn't have to offer. Thank you.
Tim, Medialand told us that despite people going through those breaks when they're in delay mode and they're shorter breaks, they actually increased their ad yield overall, didn't they?
Yes, because the average viewing time went up, so they actually had, they grew their OTT audience, and so as a result, they actually had a higher total impressions per month as a result of that.
Okay, and that figure, you said you're going to double your live viewers. You've got 3.2 as your biggest event so far. So you could have 6 million concurrent viewers all head into the ad break at exactly the same moment and complete broadcast standard insertion.
Yeah, because we'll have started doing the fetching for the ad decisioning 5 to 10 minutes before the ad break. So the key bottleneck there is ensuring that you're hitting the ad server at a pace that it can handle.
Brilliant. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.